Hello, everyone. This is Deb. Welcome to our webinar for today on planning evidence submissions. It's 1 o'clock. We've got quite a few people online, and a number of them who don't yet have audio. So I'm going to slow down just a tiny bit, and hopefully people will catch up. Welcome. Either good morning or good afternoon. If you're on the West Coast, good morning. If you're in the Midwest or on the East Coast, good afternoon. For those of you that have been attending these webinars for a while now, these are our basics. Please mute your phones. I see that a number of you have already done that. That's great. Remember to unmute, however, when you want to talk. You can ask a question a couple of different ways. One way is to wait until I have a feedback and pause break, feedback and question break, and you can just speak right up, unmute yourself and speak up. There are two other ways that you could ask a question. One is to use the chat room. At the top of your screen, there may be a pull-down menu where you can select chat, or you may have that on the side of your screen already. In which case, I've sent you a message already which says that if you want to use that feature and ask me a question, please grab the pull-down menu and select either host, presenter, or host and presenter, and that'll be sure that I can see it. A number of times in these presentations, people have been asking questions on the chat, and I haven't been able to see it. And when I called WebEx about that, they suggested that I direct people to me specifically, so I have done that. So please do. And if, for any reason, I don't acknowledge your question, please speak up when we have a pause or speak up during the presentation itself. Another way is to raise the hand. You have a little hand icon next to your name if you are looking at the participants, and you can click on that, raise that little hand, and I will call on you when we have a, when I see that your hand is raised. Okay, last bit of information before we get started, and I hope people have caught up with the audio by now, is that the recording of the webinar and the PowerPoint are going to be posted on the CAPE website by July 15th. If for any reason that doesn't happen, my email is right here on the front page, on the title page, right there, deb.eldridge@gmail.com. Please feel free to email me directly, and I will send you the PowerPoint. Okay? And actually today I'm using a little evidence chart, and if you would like a copy of that, you can email me directly as well. Okay, so our goals and objectives for today is to offer a strategy as well as a tool for planning evidence submissions for your self-study. I know this can get confusing and complicated as we're talking about CAPE evidence and the standards and knowing exactly what we should have as part of the standards, and so we'll go through that today. Objectives. What do I want you to be able to do? Well, hopefully you can describe some components of a planning tool, whether you use the one that I present to you today or you design one on your own or adapt this one. I think there's some key components to a planning tool, and that could be very helpful to you. I hope also that you can identify key elements for evidence review when you're planning your submissions, and hopefully after today you can practice using sample assessments in planning a standard 1 submission, and we will get to that. Okay, so let's get started. Here we go right away with the planning tool. I wanted to start there because when we talk about planning evidence submissions, oh my gosh, where do we begin? Well, here's a table. This was created, a tool designed by Ursuline College, and from the tool that they have graciously allowed me to use and adapt, I've transferred it onto an Excel spreadsheet by standard. It does contain only the initial standards and not the advanced standards. Ursuline had both on their chart, but for anybody who's doing their self-studies before 2017, if I'm not mistaken, it is only the initial standards that are in effect. I've categorized the content by evidence, data, interpretation, and use, and you'll see what that is. And you can complete each standard with room for a statement about how the collection of evidence meets the standard. So let me share that table with you now. And if anybody can't see it, let me know. Okay? I'm going to move my two visuals off to the side here. I've got my chat room and my participants open. Okay. So here's what we've got. Here's sort of a planning tool for you. Like I said, it's on a spreadsheet. Down below you can see Standard 1, Standard 2, Standard 3, Standard 4, Standard 5. So every one of the standards is represented here. And again, this was a tool designed by Ursula, and I thought it was a great thing. And what they've got here is, first of all, the standards by component. So each one of the components is listed out to the far left. Then we've got space for evidence, okay, and we're going to practice using this in a moment. We've got a space for data, got a space for interpretation, and then we've got a question at the bottom of each component, merely as a place really to start compiling the kinds of uses of this data that you just don't want to forget about. Because, let me scroll down a little bit here, Standard 1, as you know, has 5 components, so there we go. The very last question is, how does this collection from components 1.1 through 1.5 demonstrate that the CAPE standard is met? So this is where you can begin to insert some of the language that you've been gathering about how the data for each component has been used. Of course, that's not the only thing you're going to say here, but it's a good way to get yourself started. So using this table, we'll come back to it a couple of times during this presentation because I want to show you how you can just drop things in and how you might be able to use it, okay? So let me try to drag it back to the very beginning component. There we go. So we've got it in the right place when we go back. Okay. So back to the PowerPoint slide. This is the evidence data interpretation table, and you can see how I've adapted it and how I've given credit to Ursula College. They did a great job. Okay. Any questions or anything up to this point? I'm going to click on I don't see any questions in the chat room quite yet. And as I look over our attendees, I don't see a single hand raised. So this is great. Okay. Unless someone wants to speak up in the next few seconds, I'll be quiet. We're going to move right on to the next part. So any questions about that evidence table right now? Okay, let's move on. Okay, so here's what I've done. I thought deeply and talked to CAPE staff about what would be the steps if you were planning evidence submissions. And there is kind of a table in the accreditation handbooks that sort of lays out some things to be done over time as you're readying yourself for your CAPE site visit and for submitting your self-study. And so this is sort of a compilation of some of those suggestions as well as some of my own ideas. So you can't hold CAPE necessarily responsible for some of this. You have to blame me. The first step, I think, in planning evidence submissions is to do an evidence inventory. And we'll look at each one of these steps in turn. The next step I'm calling a relevance review. And that involves using that table and aligning with standards. The next step I'm calling a power scan to see what are your most powerful pieces of submission. It is likely that you will have lots of evidence that you could submit, and we'll talk a little bit about the limitations of AIMS in planning and submitting your evidence. Okay, so you want to use the absolutely most powerful evidence that you have on hand. Next would be a quality check. I'm asking you to do an analysis audit, and then last of all, I'm calling it a collection confirmation. So I've got 6 steps here, and we're going to go through each one of those steps. The first step is an evidence inventory. Basically, ask yourself what evidence, what assessments, what measures do we have that are unit-wide, and just list them. Now here I've put together 6 pieces of evidence that one might bring to Standard 1, okay, particularly Standard 1.1, okay, Component 1.1, which has to do with content and pedagogy. There's a state licensure content exam. You know you've got some of those. You know you've got GPA from content courses. You know you've probably got a unit plan that everybody getting initial certification or licensure to teach will be developing some kind of a unit plan or lesson plan at some point. You've got student teaching evaluations. And then I put in 2 final pieces. These may not occur at your institution, but these were samples that the NSTA, National Science Teachers Association, suggested in their sample assessments and things that they present during their presentations. So I thought, well, let's add them in. A culminating project of some kind, which in this case is teacher work sample. And then last of all, a portfolio. We often use e-portfolios today, and those are places for candidate reflection on their learning. And so I've added candidate reflection and learning portfolio as well. So if I were at an institution, of course I wouldn't start here. I'd start talking about, well, what else do we have on hand? Well, we have surveys. Well, what else do we have besides surveys? Well, we have this, you know, sample assessment and assessment lesson where the students have to do pre and post assessments and design an assessment tool. Great, throw that in there. You want to list absolutely everything that you have on hand and not sort of do too much editing at this point. Okay? All right. So step 2. Step 1, pull together a list of all the evidence you have on hand. Step 2 is your relevance review. And when CAPE talks about relevance, they are most often talking about, almost exclusively talking about, whether your assessments are aligned with standards. Okay? So here's where we can do a relevance review. So you've got your 7, 10, 29, 34 pieces of evidence that you bring to the table, and you start dropping those evidence items into that, from that inventory onto the spreadsheet. And this is where you're determining, okay, what standard, what component is that particular item likely to fit? So if we go back to our list, the first thing on our list was state content exams, okay? And, well, let's see here. We've got to have evidence of content knowledge right there in CAPE Standard 1.1. So I'm definitely going to insert my state licensure exam right here. And let's see if I can put it in there. Okay, state content exam. There we go. Looks like I'm saving a document here. All right. What other piece of evidence do we have that we could bring to bear for content? Well, on our evidence inventory, we said we had GPA in content courses. So I'm going to put GPA right here. Okay, GPA in content. All right, we also had a unit plan. Well, let's see. Yeah, the unit plan could go here under instructional practice. Okay, so I'm going to put in unit plan. And just for the sake of showing something a little different here, let's put these in italics. Okay. So what else did we have? We had student teaching observations. Oh, yes, I could put that in here as well, because that really is going to look at instructional practice. It's going to look at content. It's going to look at the learner and learning. Okay, so student teaching eval right there. And last, what else have I got? Well, I've got the teacher work sample. So I'm going to put that teacher work sample right there. Okay? So this is the part where what we're trying to do here is get to the relevance of a particular assessment to CAPE. And the relevance qualification has to do with, is it aligned with standards? Now, you're going to be able to show that in other ways too. Perhaps your student teaching evaluation has a column, okay, where the standards are listed. Your state standards, perhaps the CAPE standards or the INTAS standards, perhaps your specialty professional association standards. So there are other ways that can be demonstrated, but for CAPE purposes, they're going to want to know, why are you showing us this assessment under this particular component, okay? And you're going to want to talk about that. So here we go. We've got 5 examples of evidence at least, and we've got a 6th, which are portfolios. And let's see, we'll see a little later on as we go through these steps if maybe portfolios is a more powerful tool, and we'd want to put portfolio in here. Let's say certainly for professional responsibility. This is where that analysis audit will come in. So we'll see that in just a second. So the relevance review and alignment with the standards is happening right here. Now I haven't chosen to put any other components up here. And if I were doing this, I would. Okay, if I were doing this in real life, I'd go on and see, are there any other places where my state content examination would fulfill an aspect of the CAPE standards or components? Where else would GPA and content knowledge be an appropriate measure? And I drop it in wherever I could find that I felt it might be a useful piece of evidence, okay? But that would take up far more on the screen than we really have the room for right now. So I'm not going through that. I'm just illustrating on 1.1 where you can drop things into that table and then continue with it down to the next standard, 1.2. So let's go here. 1.2, providers ensure that completers use research and evidence to measure their students' progress and their own professional practice. What evidence do you have? Well, here you might say, oh my goodness, well that unit plan certainly is an example. And the student teaching evaluation, we definitely look at the way that they are using measuring their students' progress. Oh, and the portfolio is a good example of that because they're using research and evidence in terms of their own professional practice. And we can also use the teacher work sample. So here's where you would drop those items into 1.2 that you know you have available. Then you go on to what's your evidence that they apply content and pedagogical knowledge in response to standards. Okay? So you can continue to drop pieces of evidence into the chart in Standard 1. You can move on to Standard 2 to see where those also might be applicable, etc. Okay? Let me diminish this and move on. Okay. So the next step, step 3, is a power scan. And this is an important next step once you've taken your evidence inventory and dropped it in wherever you find that it's appropriate across all the standards. Okay? To determine the power of a particular item, you might see, okay, where is it that an item of evidence appears in multiple standards? For example, the teacher work sample. You might find that in component 1.1 on content and pedagogy. You might put it also in 1.2 that talks about the use of research and assessment to gauge one's own professional learning and the learning of one's students. You might also find that in standard 1.5, 1.4 that talks about professional responsibility. Okay, so all of these would say to you at this point, oh boy, I've got more, my teacher work sample is a really powerful piece of evidence. I've used it in a number of places. So our next question would be, well, do we have data? What kind of data do we have, and do we have 3 cycles of data? So let's go back to that. Let's go back to that chart again. I'm going to go back to our standard 1. Okay. And you'll see here where I've put data. Okay. Okay, so the next line where it says data, well, what kind of data have I got? I definitely have data on the state content exams. Oh yes, I've got data going back 10 years. Well, what CAPE requires are 3 cycles of data. And 3 cycles is an important way, or 3 administrations is an important way for it to be put. Because for your state content exams, you get those once a year. So you know you're going to have to go back 3 years. You have to put in your most current year, and you have to submit 2 years prior to that. Okay? I don't believe there's any state that I know of that releases the yearly totals. I mean, you get content results every time a test is administered. So maybe you could do that, but the yearly averages are the most important pieces that CAPE's going to want to see. They're going to want to see the official results from the state that show you state averages, and perhaps they have institutional comparisons, and those are very important. So right here, part of your power scan is to say, where do I have data? And do I have 3 cycles of data? If you do, then this is where you're going to put that. And a good thing for you to do would be to note in your chart either, you know, a hyperlink to the data because you know where it's housed, it's on your computer or your assessment coordinator's computer or whoever, or simply put a locator for yourself so that you know where it is you need to go to. There's also a point here where you could put in a comments category, okay, and say, you know, I need to look up where the last 2 years before this year are because we changed people who were in charge of this, and I'm not sure who has those last 2 years of data on hand. So there's a good opportunity here for you to put a location and also add a comment to yourself. How about GPA? If you got GPA data, you know you do, so you can put it right in here. It has to be 3 cycles, so in the case of GPAs, you don't have to go for 3 years. You could go for 3 semesters if you're looking at content courses. And you can say, well, how did our science teachers do in the biology, the chemistry, the physics, and the blah, blah, and collect that data. But maybe you have it, but you don't have it collected. Don't have it in one single place. So another good time to put in a note to yourself to remember to collect that and create a house for it and start it as a routine part of what you do out of an assessment office or the person who's in charge of your assessment. Do you have unit plan data? If so, this could be a tricky one because you know that, you know, of your 29 different programs, you know for a fact that all your initial programs do have a lesson or a unit plan of some kind. But, where is the data for that? If you're using one of the vendor systems like TK20 or Live Text or Chalk and Wire, one of those, perhaps that's where the data is housed. And so you could put down right here and make a note to yourself that you need to aggregate that data to sort of give a unit-wide average and range, but that also you might want as part of component 1.1 in all of standard 1, the data has to be disaggregated by program. So although we're talking about unit-wide assessments here, those unit-wide assessments need to be disaggregated by every program. So you're going to have to collect that evidence for every single one of your initial programs and have it in some chart form. And actually there is something on the CAPE website, I believe, about presenting GPA data and other data. And if not, the National Science Teacher Association has a very nice document called Sample Assessments, and they give examples of how data can be presented for specialty program review. And it's actually a very handy little chart. If anybody's interested in that, please email me, and I'll send that out to you. I believe it's hard to find it on the NST website, so it'd probably be easier to just send me an email. Okay, so your student teaching evaluations, have you got data on that? Make any notes to yourself, and of course your teacher work samples. So this is a place for you to say, okay, yes, and I'm going to just put some have in Dean's office, okay? My GPA, have but not aggregated plan this, okay? Unit plans, get from program coordinators. I don't know why I think I have to spell things correctly in my demo, but I do, so forgive me for going back. Student teaching evaluations, get from field office and teacher work samples get from assessment coordinator. Okay, so you've got notes here. You know at least for these 5 things you've got data. Okay, so this looking like, if we're looking at our criteria here, in the power scan, I've got items of evidence that appear appropriate for multiple standards, so those are ones that I'm going to want to indicate on my chart somehow that those are keepers. Okay? Do I have data? If I've got data for each of those, that's good. And do I have 3 cycles of data? I know I do. And so I'm in pretty good shape on component 1.1. Something to keep in mind about uploading your evidence samples. We'll be talking next week, yes, next week, about answering the evidence questions. The new template for self-study documents is available on AIMS now, and so we'll be going through that document and looking at the questions and their answers. But an important criteria to remember is you're only allowed 90 pieces of evidence, okay? So when we get down to some of the next items of review here, the analysis, audit, etc., you want to see sort of grand total, how many items of evidence have you got here, because CAPE is not going to allow you to upload more than 90, okay? And the next thing to remember is that evidence uploads have been increased to 20 megabytes. It used to be 10, and now they're 20. So in the CAPE self-study template allows you to upload all kinds of data in all kinds of formats, and it allows up to 20 megabytes, which is quite a bit. So when you're pulling your things together, you can also think about, okay, 90 pieces of evidence, maybe creating a list for yourself, a master list of the items of evidence that you're considering uploading, and see where you're getting to, okay? And put it on an Excel sheet and keep track of it that way for yourself. Okay, step 3. I do see a note from somebody to send a copy of that NSTA doc. I will certainly do that. I need you to remember that, well, I'll see if I can make a note. As soon as we end this webinar, all of these chats disappear, and I can't retrieve them. So if you don't get it from me within a couple days, email me, okay? There we go. Okay, so the next thing we're going to want to do is a quality check. We've got our 5 pieces of evidence for CAPE Standard 1, Component 1.1. We've looked and seen that we have data for each of those, and we know where it is and where to get it. And we've already established a home for all this data, a consolidation or a central location, central house, central warehouse for the data. So we're going to go on with our quality check here as we're planning our submissions, okay? And so here's a quality check that is not part of this table at all, okay? But I've created another table for you that you can use, made it up out of my own brain. So if you hate it, absolutely feel no obligation to use it. But I just wanted to illustrate that there's a way for us to sort of organize ourselves, and the table isn't going to do everything. So one of the things we wanted to do was quality check. CAPE's going to be looking for relevance. You know what the relevance is because we've already aligned them with the CAPE and the INTAS standards in step 2. So we know how that alignment goes. And as I mentioned, there's other ways to show relevance by further alignment with your state standards or your professional association standards. The next one is about validity. How has validity been established? Oh boy. So this could be an area where you say to yourself, you know, we've got all these student teaching evaluations and yikes, I don't know. Have we ever done any validity check? Did we ever get any stakeholder input into those items that we have on that thing? Maybe it might be time to do some homework. Okay. You're going to look for inter-rater reliability on most things. When CAPE talks about validity, and we're going to be doing 2 webinars on these items in August. They're one on validity. We're going to talk primarily about construct or content validity because that is what CAPE is saying they are most interested in. Okay? We know there are other types of validity. We can get very scientific and researchy about this, but CAPE is primarily interested in either content or construct validity. And in August, we'll talk about those in detail. We also want to know, CAPE is going to want to know about your evidence items, your instrumentation. Have you done reliability on that? And in CAPE's case, they're most interested in inter-rater reliability, because most often when it comes to our student teaching evaluations, our observation protocols, those are things where you have multiple people assessing your candidates using the same instrument, whether those are your cooperating and mentor teachers, or they're the content supervisors or the pedagogical supervisors. I do know places where there are at least 3 people that go out to observe student teachers. Then establishing some reliability amongst them in how they're rating your candidates is very important. So you're going to want to look at each one of those items that you've uploaded as possible evidence sources and do this quality check. Okay? Let's go to the next one, because that's the little table that I told you you are welcome to use or disuse or create your own, but it's really pretty simple here. We want to know, I have not put relevance in here because it was part of step 2. So I started with content validity. We have content validity or construct validity or some kind of validity. If your state has it, then here's what. Put in state contact state for info on validity. How was it established? Inter-rater reliability, okay, is not something that you're going to need for a licensure exam, but there probably is reliability. Contact state for reliability info. Reliability info, okay? Is it representative? You can put a big old check mark in there or an X. Yes, because you know you have licensure exam information on every single one of your candidates. So that's a good representative piece of data there. And is it actionable? Has stakeholders been involved? Actionable, what have you learned from, can you learn from these exam scores? Who else looks at the exams besides your dean's office to see what your pass rate is? You know, how is this information shared? And this is a good place here to start making some notes for yourself. Dean shares at data retreat with our P12 partners. Okay, so we know it's actionable. Perhaps you will find, I remember back in the day when I was looking at state licensure exam scores for the college that I was at, and we found that it was our elementary students who were consistently scoring below the state average. Why was that? And so we did an analysis going back a couple of years into the scores of those who were failing the exam, okay? Who were these people that were failing our state licensure exams? Did they have any characteristics in common? And in fact, we did find that the elementary education majors who were failing the exam seemed to have some common characteristics. In our case, it was because we were finding that out of 5 candidates that failed the elementary exam, 4 of them were transfers from community colleges. And so that was a big red flag to us. It didn't say we didn't conclude not to take any more community college students in. What we determined was that when they came in as transfers from a community college, that there was a need for us to institute some kind of workshop series for them. And to put in, we put in one of those test prep courses and got the money out of a mini grant, or anyways. So not to go into too much detail here, but looking at your state licensure exam scores can be very revealing and can help you solve some problems if you have them. And in our case, we had very low elementary ed scores, and looking at that data more closely gave us a lot of insights and ideas and suggestions for what we could do. Okay, so you would go through this for each one of your evidence items, is to do this quality check. If you find out, for example, in your unit, let's say student teaching evaluations, that you don't have any, wow, What? Okay, content validity, and I'm trying to be humorous here. I'm not trying to blow this off as if it were unimportant. I'm trying to create a little humor here. Ooh, I'm not so sure. You know, our student teaching evaluations were created 5 years ago, and I don't know if we have content or construct validity on those. And if we do, I don't know how that was done, and so I got to look into that. Okay, I need to look into this. All right, how about interrelatability? Interrater reliability. I don't think we have ever done this. Time to start. Okay, so as we're going through this and you're saying, boy, you know, I've already identified the student teaching evaluation as a really key piece of data. It's a powerful instrument. I use that a lot. I use that on each one of the components in Standard 1. I use it in Component 2.1 because 2.3 because that has to do with the clinical experience. I use it in Component 3.4, I think it's 3.4, that talks about selectivity at the end of the program, at program completion. Oh my gosh, and I can't answer these construct and content validity questions. We need to do some homework, and we need to establish the content or construct validity on our student teaching evaluations, okay? People are saying you lost audio. According to my, thank you so much for those of you sending this to host, because I can see your questions. I am speaking. If you lost audio, it's showing on my screen that I'm talking. So if somebody can't hear me, check your audio connection, okay? Make sure that you've got it and that you didn't lose it at your end. What if the state imposes, okay, people are saying they can hear me. What if the state imposes its own format for a student teaching evaluation? Then you're in great shape. If your state is imposing its own criteria and its own format for your student teaching evaluations, then what you need to say down here, where I've put what is contact state for information, okay? How did they do the content and the construct validity on those? And are they providing interrater reliability training? And have you attended those trainings? Okay, those are things you're going to want to know. All right, and then you can, as I don't think I need to go on and on here about this particular chart. I'm going to get this one out of the way so we can see our last two pieces there. We're going to want to check each category. If where we find out that we've got some holes, all right, then we know what it is we need to do in order to have a high quality item of evidence for submission in the standards. Okay, good. Let's go on to the next one. We're already at 1:38. We've got a few more minutes to go here, and we'll open it up for questions. So, as I began to point out when we filled out that chart on the previous slide, now you get to look at where are the gaps. So you get to look at the gaps in terms of the quality check, and you also get to look at your gaps here. Have you got places where you don't have any evidence? Okay, we know that you did an evidence inventory at the very first. Well, maybe you go back to your Standard 2 here. Okay, let me drag this up. You go back to your Standard 2 and you go, oh, wow, ooh, you know, we haven't thought about what evidence we have for partnerships. What is our evidence for partnerships? Okay, well, we've got MOUs. No, wait, we don't have MOUs. We used to have MOUs 3 years ago, but we discontinued using MOUs. Wow, okay. So some of the things that you can do when you have these gaps and you find that you're not showing any evidence here is you can use the accreditation handbook, which has a great evidence table. I think it starts on around page 88 or so. That gives examples of evidence that can be submitted for each and every component. And so a great place for you to start when you have identified gaps is to go into that table and say, oh, look, you know, CAPE says we can submit all kinds of stuff here. Oh my gosh, well, we don't have MOUs, but we do have this, so we do have that. And it'll be a good way for you to identify pieces of evidence that you need to collect. in which case you might just put down MOUs here. We'll put MOUs with a question mark. It looks like mouse. MOUs, question mark. Okay, and maybe with a different color or a different font or something to have you know that this is something you really need to follow up on. So what we're trying to do in going back here in the analysis audit, okay, is to look at the gaps. Where are the gaps? Where don't you have evidence? Where are you weak on data? You don't have 3 years. So this might be a time for you to substitute a particular piece of evidence for something else. You say, you know, I thought that was a good idea. It was on our evidence inventory, and I dropped it into this particular component, but boy, we don't have any data, and it's not good quality, or we've got some data but not a lot, and it's not meeting the quality criteria, whereas this other tool is much more powerful, and it can also be used here. Let's get this out, okay? What you're going to want to also look at as you do your analysis is on the chart, the next part of what we've done here. We've done evidence. Okay, let me go back to the first standard. There we go. We've done evidence. We've looked at the data. We know where it occurs. Okay, here's an opportunity for interpretation. When you think about interpretation for each of your components, this is when you're going to start gathering the kinds of language that you're going to draw from as you answer the million-dollar question right down here. How does this data collection demonstrate that the CAPE standard is met? So that's why I think it's really important to have this interpretation in at each component. You're not going to have to interpret your data for CAPE for every single component, every single item of evidence, but it helps you to gather the language that you can then use when you're answering the question for the entire standard. Okay? And also here, how has the data from 1.1 been used to improve? All right? So let's go back to that analysis audit and say, okay, is there a basis for comparison? We've got our GPAs in the content courses. Well, let me start with the state licensure exam. Usually the state licensure exams come with a state average, you know, like a state average pass rate is 92%, state average. The average pass rate for public institutions is 89%. For private institutions, it's 93%, you know, whatever. That gives you a basis for comparison. You could also see, if you use a Praxis, what are the national averages, okay? So you've got a basis for comparison and for benchmarking there. You can say how your candidates are doing, not just in terms of your own institution, but in terms of other like institutions, in terms of the entire state, and in terms of nationally. That's great. But if you're coming across your unit plan, okay, what is your basis for comparison going to be? How are your candidates doing? Well, this is where you're going to have to be a little bit creative in how you approach that question. You're also going to want to be asking if your stakeholders have been involved. As you answer each one of these questions about, you know, stakeholder involvement, which we did in the quality check, okay, that's great. But if stakeholders haven't been involved, maybe it's a time to get them involved. And also, you'll remember that in Standard 5, well, it's Standard 5, I think it's Component 5.5, where the component asks about stakeholder involvement as a whole. So as you're thinking about how stakeholders have been engaged in each one of these pieces of evidence, that argument about that can be used to fulfill CAPE Standard 5 and Component 5.5 when it asks specifically about stakeholder input. Okay, and then a last kind of analysis audit is to look across all 5 pieces of evidence or across all the evidence you have for a particular component and say, okay, is it balanced? Do we have some formative? Do we have some summative? Do we have quantitative as well as qualitative data? You want to look and just see, is there a good balance across the evidence items that you're submitting? And where you might be in very, very good shape on Component 1.1, Standard 1 tends to be the standard where we have lots of evidence, okay? And it might not necessarily be the case for standard 3, okay? Maybe you don't have a lot of evidence about recruitment plans, okay? And you don't have a lot of data. It's not something you've done before and you've got to start doing, okay? So that is an area for you to think about right there, okay? All right. So we don't have a lot of balanced data. We've only got one thing in there in terms of how we recruit students, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a good way to sort of double check yourself at the analysis stage. And there's only one more step in this whole thing, and that is to interpret the entire collection of evidence for the standard. And I've taken these questions directly from the evidence guide. What is the collection telling you about your candidates or your partnerships or your selectivity processes, practices? Notice, what is the collection telling you about your candidates? Standard 1. What is the collection telling you about your partnerships? Standard 2 question. What is the collection telling you about your selectivity practices? Standard 3 question, okay? You want to be interpreting that entire collection of evidence, not component by component, okay, going through and saying, well, this is what component 1 tells us, this is what component 2 tells us. You want to be looking at it holistically and acknowledging if there are any weaknesses as well. Stevie Chepko made this point very strongly and asked me to be sure and insert it here, is that acknowledging that you have some gaps or that there are some things that you're not understanding or areas in which your candidates are not doing as well as you would like is fine. It's fine to acknowledge those things. Better that you discover that and acknowledge it in your report than that you try to gloss it over or pretend it doesn't exist, okay, and have instead the CAPE reviewers discover it and say, well, wait a second, what about this right here? Okay, so if you do acknowledge something that isn't exactly where you need it to be, then what you do with that acknowledgement when you talk about the collection as a whole is to tell CAPE what your plans are for addressing it, okay? And then the last big beware here is something that CAPE staff also asked me to highlight, which is don't draw big broad conclusions from a limited data set. So for example, if you have candidate surveys and employer surveys and you've only got less than a 10% return rate on those surveys, that's kind of a limited data set and it may not be entirely representative, and you don't want to be drawing broad conclusions about how content all your candidates are, how satisfied they feel with their preparation based on such a limited data set. So just beware here. We know this from having done our dissertations, okay? You know, word to the wise here. See that someone is asking, can I give an example of a broad conclusion? Yeah, I can, and that's the one I just gave you, okay? So if you're not getting a good rate of return on your surveys, don't come across like everything's hunky-dory, okay? And then you can acknowledge that you've got really low rates of return, and here's what you intend to do about that, okay, in order to improve the rates of return. But you can also use it as a comparison point and say, well, these are how our candidates have responded in terms of their satisfaction about their programs, and here's how the employers have responded about program satisfaction. And you know, this is for Standard 4, and yet at the end of our programs, we also do an exit survey, and we noticed that our candidates felt a lot more prepared. And we have data for all of our candidates on the exit survey, and they felt, from those, we know that they felt a lot more prepared than the small returns, albeit small, number of returns we're getting on our completers. So it is an indication to us that there's a difference here, and so we're going to start doing some focus groups or whatever. Again, go ahead and acknowledge if something isn't feeling quite right, isn't looking quite right to you, and it's raising questions. And you can raise those questions as you respond to the collection as a whole. And that's where I'm talking about collection coherence here. respond as if it's something that's not quite right, and then what your intention is. Okay. I now have the question pause. And that has been a long series of questions for me. I did get some on my chat, so I appreciate that. I'm going to go to view the attendees. You should be seeing a gray grayed out area in the middle of your screen, because I'm looking at all the participants to see if there are any hands raised. And right now I don't see a single hand raised. Anybody? Okay. So I'm just going to be quiet for a minute and say, does anybody have a question? If so, please speak up. Okay. So let me go on to next steps. Feedback survey. Everybody who participates in these, and a number of you, I see your names again and again and again, and you must be sick to death of the same survey or similar surveys coming to you every couple of weeks, but it is our duty to send these out and to get your feedback, and I have made changes based on the feedback that I've gotten from folks. The one time we got interrupted by my barking dog, I have that dog under wraps so it doesn't happen again. That was intended to be a humorous example, but I also have other ways in which I have improved these webinars with your feedback, so I appreciate whatever you can tell us. You should get that by July 10th. When I finish the webinar today, I'll put that together and send it out to you. July 16th is our next webinar, and I mentioned it's going to be on answering the evidence questions. As I said, the new AIMS template for self-studies is online and available, so we're going to dig right into AIMS, look at those, go through both the self-study evidence submissions and the self-study report questions, and talk about ways to address those questions as you submit your evidence. And then last, we've got 2 webinars coming up in August. One of them focuses on validity, one of them focuses on reliability. I'm not sharing the dates of those yet because we have to finalize them. There have been some things that have come up in August, and we're having to work around a number of dates. So those will come out in the, in the newsletters that come out from CAPE. I think they come out on Tuesdays, and they always include the upcoming webinars in that newsletter. I did get a question about whether the template from Ursuline can be shared. Yes. I can share 2 things with you. I can share both the Ursuline template and I can share my adaptation of it. So again, if you just shoot me an email when this is over and let me write down my email address in big letters right here, I'll be sure and send those out today. Okay, so it's Deb, not FDeb, Deb.Eldridge, hello, eldridge@gmail.com. for NSTA sample assessment, evidence, data, interpretation table, and Ursuline table. Okay? Good. Anything else for anybody? Because I believe that's my last slide. It is. So our webinar for today is concluded, and I will hang out here in case anybody wants to hang on. Oh, I see a hand up. Wonderful. Janine, you have a question, and I'll be hanging out here to answer questions as long as I need to. So, Janine, if you can hear me, unmute yourself and ask away. Jeannie? Jeannie, you have a question? question? Okay. I'm looking over the questions that have been submitted, and I see there's one here that asks about what restrictions exist on using the same evidence repeatedly to meet several standards. There are no restrictions on using a piece of evidence multiple times. As a matter of fact, that contributes to the power of a piece of evidence, is that it is useful in multiple standards and multiple components. So there are no restrictions there. If it fits, you can use it. There was a question about cycles of data. I thought I had answered that. A cycle of data, if it's a semester or a year, depends on your data, on your evidence. If it is, for example, an employer survey that you send out once a year at the end of the year, then you would need 3 years, so 3 administrations, okay, or 3 applications. If it's a student teaching evaluation that you would use each semester, because you have student teachers in fall and you have student teachers again in spring, then you can talk about it being per semester. That's why CAPE doesn't say 3 semesters of data or 3 years of data. Instead, they say 3 administrations or 3 cycles, okay, because it's dependent upon the instrument itself. Okay. Let me see if there are any other questions. Yes, Cynthia said she lost audio, and somebody said they could hear me, so I assume that isn't a problem. At your end, can I give an example of that? I can share the template. Okay. Unless Jeannie Von Dylan wants to speak up, I see your hand is up, Jeannie. Then I'm going to conclude this webinar because there are no additional questions. I thank you all for attending today, and I hope that you'll return the survey when I send it to you. Bye-bye.